Tak dobré dopoledne, vážené kolegyně, vážení kolegové.
Morning, dear colleagues, dear guests. I would like to welcome you at our first panel of a conference dedicated to 100 years since founding of the Czechoslovak Communist Party. The first panel's title is Czechoslovak Communism Colonizing and Colonized. Will be dedicated to Czechoslovakia and also to international relationships Czechoslovakia had. So the first speaker in this panel is Molly Pucci, who teaches 20th century European history at Trinity College in Dublin. She studied Russian, East European, and Central Asian studies at Harvard, and she received her MA and PhD in history at Stanford University. Her thesis was dedicated to the state security courses in Czechoslovakia and Germany. And it was published under the title Security Empire, the Secret Police in Communist Eastern Europe by Yale University Press. She will speak about the interwar Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, and she will speak about years 1921 to 1929 specifically. So I would like to pass you the floor, Molly.
Okay, you can see my screen, right? Okay, thank you all very much for inviting me to be here today and to start off this fascinating looking conference. So as mentioned, I'll be talking about the KSČ and the national question with a focus on the 1920s. And I'll say that I'm really only going to scratch the surface of this massive issue that I am very happy to see that other panelists are also talking about the individual nationalities in this very diverse political party. So I'll make two broad arguments today. The first is really the centrality of the national question to the KSČ in its policies, its self-conception, and its organization in the 1920s. So putting the national question back into this question of the origins, the earliest years of communism. And second is really the centrality of the national question to understanding the particular fascination that the Soviet Union had for people, for communists, but for the left in the 1920s. So the Soviet Union, not only as a sort of economic and social and political experiment, but also as one of the most radical nation-building projects in the 20th century, really. So putting that back into the conversation, I'll talk a little bit today about the contact that the Czechoslovak communists would have had with the Soviet nationality issue as well. So the Soviet Union, in the 1920s, promised to resolve the national question. That was actually sort of the terms they used at the time. And you can imagine that for politicians and others in the Czechoslovak communist movement, many of whom had sort of made their careers in the late Habsburg Empire, and an era in which the national question had been a burning one and also sort of a very dysfunctional one. This was of great fascination and excitement, this idea that the Soviet Union had finally solved this issue that they had all faced for the past few decades. So I recognize that we're celebrating with this conference, the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia in May 1921. But I'm actually going to sort of start with a little bit of what is arguably the second founding date of the Czechoslovak Communist Party, and that is the Unity Congress in October and November 1921. And this is the Congress that brought together the various national communist parties that had been formed in Czechoslovakia. As everyone attending this Congress, I'm sure knows, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia was allowed to join the Comintern in May 1921 under the condition that it eventually unify with the other national communist parties that had been created and sort of organized generally from the social democratic leftist movements of those national groups, in 1921. So this is what you actually end up with, a very, very diverse party linguistically, nationally. Several of these, movements come from different communist traditions you have coming together at this time, right? Different social democratic traditions. And so you have actually going into this period a great deal of diversity. So initially, I'll sort of, as you can imagine, this is going to be one of the biggest, most contested issues of the 1920s, is the balance between the central party and these national branches. And so I'm just going to sort of draw this in broad strokes. The model for the party was actually not the Bolshevik Party. The Bolshevik Party was, of course, a very nationally diverse party, but it was highly centralized. And so it didn't really allow for various, autonomy for its national branches. But it was thought to be highly centralized because of the particular conditions in which the Bolshevik Party was created, right? It was created as an illegal underground conspiratorial party, and then one that was fighting a civil war. So this idea of a highly centralized military-style disciplined party made sense in, right, given the conditions in which the Bolsheviks had been fighting, but it didn't really make sense in the first Czechoslovak Republic, because, right, this is the Communists are a parliamentary party, and their goal is really to sort of expand mass support for the party. And so it takes as its model not the Bolsheviks, but actually it calls itself a small international. So it takes actually the Comintern as the model for how the party is set up. The balance between central authority and the national branches at this time. So they refer themselves as the small international. And this was thought as a way to balance, this degree of central authority with local particularities and with different traditions of communism in different languages. So the Comintern in the 1920s was not as centralized or controlled by the Soviets as it was in the 1930s. It was actually really quite clearly an attempt to balance these national particularities. And if you look at point 17 of the Comintern's main points, it basically says, all decisions are binding on all affiliate parties. It must be a far more centralized organization than the Second International, but it stands to reason that it also must take into account the diversity of conditions in which the respective parties have to fight and work, and adopt decisions binding on all parties only in matters in which such decisions are possible. So what you have here is actually this attempt to balance, right, sort of central authority with the creation of and sustaining of different national branches. And many of the early branches just sort of took the traditions right out of the social democratic left, right? The party organizations, you see the newspapers often continue to function. And of course, the whole system is united by the principle of democratic centralism, the idea that all parties would discuss and vote, but then at the end of the day, you would get the decision would be made and it would be binding on all. It was actually sort of a compromise, right, between the idea that you would sustain national particularities, but at the same time, at the end of the day, you needed to reach a unified decision. And similar to the Comintern, it was thought that over time, and certainly after the revolution, national issues will go away and they'll sort of all blend together into the this world communist movement, this organized communist movement. So the nationality question would eventually be resolved, and this party would be brought into a single whole. So it's this balance of sort of national particularities and central authority. So that's more or less sort of in general strokes how this was thought of. And again, it's contingent on, okay, this is actually before the revolution. So what's going to happen once the revolution comes into place? And everybody is, of course, looking at the one revolution that has happened, which is in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union in the 1940s had a very strong message about nationality. They had a very strong message that they had, again, they were resolving the national question. So it's actually, there's a huge literature on this, and I won't get into the details in as much as I perhaps could, but to give you a general sense of what this looked like, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which was founded in January 1924, it had a federal system of governance. So you had military foreign policy in the party, of course, as central, but it devolved a considerable amount of authority to the national territories and the national republics, issues like local government, education, culture, language, the development of national schools. And it went a step further, right? It wasn't just about tolerating national minorities. It was about actively building them and promoting members of national minorities and bringing sort of minority nations up to modernization standards as it was thought of. So you actually have the active promotion of non-Russian national minorities, the creation and codification of national languages. And as I'll talk about, culture is actually a huge part of this. So making Belarusian, making Ukrainian into a literary language, as well as just sort of a language of everyday use, building national schools, and staffing administration with local nationals, right? So what Terry Martin called the affirmative action empire. So not only, bringing, basically, favoring national minorities in positions in their national republic. So it's an incredibly radical experiment in multinational state building. And it's also one that is sort of followed with great fascination, we'll say, in Europe in general, but in Czechoslovakia in particular. So this is a sort of piece of an article on the Czechoslovak workers delegation to the USSR. There's a number of these workers delegations, particularly between 1925 and 1927. And so they would be shown around various parts of the USSR, and they would return to Prague and stage these rallies to talk about what they had seen in the USSR, and sort of, meet with people and talk about, okay, well, as a Czech worker, I saw what they're building in the USSR, right? There's sort of a big campaign around these workers delegations. But this particular one, as you can see, really focused on the nationality question, right? So they didn't just go to Moscow. They arrived in Kazan, the capital of the autonomous Tatar Soviet Republic, right? Another group of 12 went to the Georgian capital of Tbilisi. And then you could sort of see at the end, the delegates showed great interest in the perfect resolution of the national question in the Soviet Union, to such an extent that they decided to visit the Republic of Dagestan on their way back as yet another study in resolving the national question. So it was integrated into what you would see as a foreigner touring the Soviet Union at this time. And there was a number of these sort of tours of foreign delegations visiting the Soviet Union in the mid-1920s. This is, so the International Lenin School was the first school for foreign communists, which a number of high-ranking, basically young communists who came to power with the Gottwald coup in 1929 sort of attended this International Lenin School. So this is the notes of Maria Shvedomova, which you can find in her memoir. And delegates, sort of, the students were allowed to choose how to spend their vacation, and they could spend it in a factory, seeing sort of the factory life and the reorganization of the economy, on an agricultural commune, or in a Soviet republic, a Soviet national republic. So Maria Shvedomova actually goes to Buryat, Mongolia, and Central Asia to see how the Soviet Union has resolved the national question. Right, so she talks about life there, the huge open spaces, the camels, the herdsmen, and how within this conditions, they were building a district Soviet. And so local delegates came in and they were taking part in their administration and building education, building an intelligentsia there, right, establishing schools and all of these things. And so part of this is, right, this idea that we've had that this exchange only happened between, you know, Prague and Moscow. This is a closed world. This is a world that is really sort of held in the highest echelons. This is not really true. They travel, you know, the Czechoslovak delegates traveled to various parts of the USSR, and places like Central Asia and Siberia were of particular fascination because it was not only about, it was depicted as really a civilizational project, right? So it wasn't just about European, you know, parts of Russia. Russia was depicted as a country that bridged Europe and Asia, and as an experiment that was much more sort of radically taking on these questions of modernization. And I think also a huge part of the fascination was the sheer size of Russia, the diversity, the number of languages and national groups that it was, right, sort of the Soviet Union, was bringing together at this time, and the experiment with how to do that exactly and how to bring everyone into this project. And this, you know, these types of, you know, travels are all over the 1920s if you're sort of looking for them. So this is just one other example of in 1927, the Soviet Union had an unveiling campaign in Central Asia where they you know, were taking, you know, trying to unveil the women in the local population and sort of bring women into modernity and educate them, and all of these sort of really radical experiments. And sort of, this is also talked about as well as sort of one of these, as sort of the crucible, right, as sort of the most radical sort of version of the Soviet model and what it was doing. So, okay, that was the Czechs visiting, and I'll try to get through this quickly because it's a big issue. So that was the Czechs visiting the Soviet Union, but you also had the Soviet Union coming to Prague, right? So there was Belarusian writers, Ukrainian writers delegations came to Prague in the mid-20s to talk about, among other things, the building of these languages as literary languages, as literary canons. So on the left, you have actually a Belarusian, I'm sorry, got a little cut off. You have a poem written by a Belarusian writer, and it's published, of course, in the literary section of Rude Pravo. And part of it is, it has this footnote, as you can see right next to it, a really long footnote that describes the background of the author, his poor, you know, the conditions of poverty from which he came in this backwards part of, you know, the Tsarist Empire, and how he, you know, promoting him was part of this larger project of creating the Belarusian language as a literary language and sort of bringing it up to the standards of sort of majority languages. So it always, you know, you'd always see sort of these works by these writers, but also this explanation of how that was the product of this, this experiment in multinational culture, actually, as well as state building. So again, this is sort of Belarusian writers visit Prague. And so it's really spreading this message of multinationalism. Ilya Ehrenberg was, you know, a big figure in this. He's been discussed as sort of a cultural ambassador in this period, and he was seen as that. So he visited Prague a number of times in 1927, 1929. And you can see this is a piece of what was published about him in the cultural journal Kmen. And it really links his success to this, you know, attempt to sort of raise up writers of marginal backgrounds in the Soviet Union, right? It forefronts the fact that he was of Jewish background, and that he had become a major writer, which he had, and he was a member of this new generation that was sort of promoted right in the early 1920s as part of this new canon. And he makes a trip actually to Slovakia in 1929. And he meets with representatives of the Slovak avant-garde, and you can actually see a number of articles in the newspaper about this, about how he was helping in discussing the creation of a Slovak literary and cultural canon with the Slovaks, and sort of serving as this representative of the Soviet nationality project, and bringing that to these other smaller countries that were also trying to build their literary and cultural canon. So it's sort of this very direct influence. And you can imagine how powerful this message is in Europe at this time, right? With the rise of fascism, the rise of virulent nationalism, the rise of anti-Semitism. This is, the type of article you would see alongside, okay, the Soviets are promoting national minorities, they're bringing them, they're creating new literary canons and a very diverse multinational voice, at the same time that the fascists are actively, right? This is 1920s, that was really Italy, but this message becomes stronger and stronger as the 1930s go on for obvious reasons, right? So that contrast you would see, this is what they're doing in the Soviet Union, this is what they're doing in other countries of Europe. And I'll sort of end with the slide, but this issue continues into the Stalinist period as being one of the strongest, I think, partially because fascism and anti-Semitism get worse in Europe, so the contrast becomes more obvious. But what you see on the left is a brochure celebrating the Soviet Constitution, and you can see Stalin obviously right in the middle, and this is in 1936, and the centrality of the national question to the image that the Soviet Union is projecting at this time, right? You have on the left, you see a Jewish figure in the Jewish Autonomous Republic of Borobijan. You had something as extreme as the creation of a Jewish Autonomous Republic, right, in 1934, and you're contrasting that with the rise of anti-Semitism in the rest of Europe. So you have this sort of astonishing sort of, image of multinationalism. And actually, Stalin himself, of course, had risen in conversation with the national question, right? So this is the first article I was able to find by Stalin in the Czechoslovak press, so from 1923. Before this, you really had the main Bolsheviks at the time that were sort of featured in the press were, of course, Lenin, but Trotsky, Bukharin, Zinoviev, who's head of the Comintern. They would have really been the main representatives of Bolshevism in the world and globally, really, in the early 1920s. And Stalin would have been largely unknown. I mean, I was unable to really find any references to him in any meaningful way until he starts weighing in as the first commissar for nationalities. So he really rises with this question and this conversation about nationality policy. And so you see him, right? So again, this is sort of the early version, January 1923, but throughout the Comintern conversations about nationality, he gets an increasingly prominent voice. And so this is really sort of his forte. So you can see that with the Soviet Constitution, when he's in the center of this multinational polity, this is the larger context in which it would have been seen. So I'll end here because I'm sure I went over, but thank you for your attention.
Děkuji, Molly, moc krát za skvělou prezentaci.
Thank you, Molly, for your wonderful presentation. Of course, it's a very wide issue, so it's pretty difficult to fit it into 15 minutes, but we will definitely get back to it when we have the discussion later on. I would like to remind you all that you can now already think about your questions, contributions. You can write it into the chat, and we will read them later on and pass it on to our participants who will try and answer them. We will still keep discussing the national question of the interwar period.
Kde v druhé polovině 20. let vykonával funkci v balkánském sekretariátu a zabýval se tedy národní otázkou na Balkáně. Stefan Gužvica je doktorským studentem na univerzitě,
a doctoral student at the University of Regensburg, in the Graduate School for East and Southeast European Studies. He's currently working on a dissertation about the Balkan Communist Federation under the supervision of Professor Brunbauer.
Výrazně se nicméně již zapsal svoji magisterskou prací, kterou obhájil na Středoevropské univerzitě v Budapešti, která se týkala
did his masters, he says, at the University of Budapest about the Yugoslav Communist Party, and it was published by the Tallinn University in English and also in Croatian. So this book is entitled Before Tito, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia during the Great Purge, 1936 to 1940. And there has been a lot of interest in this publication, especially in former Yugoslavian countries, and I suppose it will be translated to more languages. So now Stefan Gužvica is going to present his contribution entitled The Prophet Converted, Šmeral, the National Question and the Communist Parties of the Balkans. So Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ondřej. I would just briefly like to mention, so during the course of my research, my topic kind of got extended. So the preliminary title of my dissertation, now I've kind of moved beyond to the purges and to, well, the Balkan Communist Federation, which is how I got to Šmeral. So now my topic is titled Sickle Without a Hammer, Revolution and Nation Building in the Balkans, 1900s to the 1930s. And as I mentioned, this is kind of what brought me to Šmeral, and I think that Molly's talk actually presented a very nice and exhaustive introduction to what I'm going to be talking about today. So I will try to present the work of Bohumir Šmeral by placing it in a broader transnational context and examining it through the lens of his activity in the Comintern in the 1920s, specifically by looking at his relationship to the Balkans. You might notice from the first slide that I slightly altered the title by adding the question mark instead of a colon. I think it better captures the ambiguity of Šmeral, which I hope to illustrate today, but I will of course elaborate on that later on. First off, I want to just briefly outline the established historiographical view of Šmeral, and that is the one which presents him as on the right of the international communist movement. Of course, this view was not merely the property of historians. It was first introduced by high-ranking members of the Comintern itself, such as Zinoviev and Radek, who considered Šmeral a rightist or even a right-wing opportunist. Translated from the Comintern jargon, this effectively meant that Šmeral was, in their view, a social democrat who internalized the basic tenets of the Second International and never truly became a communist. He was thus prone, in the Comintern's view, to errors regarding collaboration with the bourgeois parties or inability to properly grasp the Leninist view of the national question. This was considered a consequence of his previous profound involvement with the theoretical traditions of Austro-Marxism. This view of Šmeral, the rightist, is now a matter of general historiographic consensus. You will find that the work of Rupnik, which you see on the slide, in Kevin McDermott, in Ben Fox, in Zdeněk Suda's Zealots and Rebels, and so on. Of course, I am better acquainted with the English language historiography, so do recommend me some more Czech works in case I might be missing some. The story of Šmeral's radicalization is also quite well known, both chronicled by him and by subsequent authors, such as in the first volume of Lenin and the Comintern by Lazić and Drašković. However, Šmeral remained convinced that communist parties in different countries should follow different paths. This was something he shared with Lenin, who at his final public appearance before the Third International in 1922, actually criticized the Comintern's organizational theses as being, in his words, too Russian. About 9 months after Lenin's death, at a party meeting in Kladno, Šmeral warned, and I quote, against mechanically transferring a solution correct in one state to another state without examining the concrete conditions. Such a view would become the essence of his conflicts with the Comintern, and the one that concerns me the most began precisely in 1924 with the formal advent of Bolshevization at this organization's 5th Congress. The communists were from then on explicitly supposed to follow one uniform set of prescriptions, and Šmeral in particular was not enthusiastic about this. He and the other leading Czechoslovak communists, although critical of the new republic, did not question its territorial integrity, nor the existence of a single Czechoslovak nation. However, the Comintern under Zinoviev had turned to the left, and the national question was now considered key in fomenting revolutionary upheaval. Namely, the idea was that, similarly to Russia in 1917, right to self-determination, including secession, should be utilized to bring down an existing capitalist or feudal regime, and the states could later, through the revolution, opt to join or not join the new socialist community. In the Czechoslovak context, much like in many others, the communists of the majority nation tended generally to oppose this policy, while the minorities, and in the Czechoslovak case, primarily Slovaks, Hungarians, and Ruthenians, generally endorsed it. The former, so then mostly the Czechs, became the party right, and the latter, the Slovaks, Hungarians, and so on, became the party left. My own research seeks to problematize this division, and although Šmeral came to be identified with the party right, his work in the Balkans seems to show an affinity to the party left, or at the very least a support for Comintern directives which favored these policies of self-determination that were precisely the kinds of policies that he had originally opposed in the Czechoslovak context. Therefore, I will now move on to his work in the Balkan Peninsula itself. Šmeral had been profoundly involved with the region ever since the time of the Second International, when he was a frequent visitor at the conferences of Serbian and Bulgarian Social Democrats, as well as those of the South Slavs of the Habsburg monarchy. He became particularly involved around the time of the Balkan Wars, and all of this made him the logical choice for the Comintern's emissary for becoming the Comintern's emissary to the region in the 1920s. I will examine a couple of case studies before painting a sort of a broader picture of his involvement. So in Romania, for instance, Šmeral was one of the actors pushing for the pursuit of the policy of self-determination until secession. He was particularly active in regards to the cooperation with the Dobrujan Revolutionary Organization, which was formed under the auspices of the Comintern in 1925. This group of dissatisfied ethnic Bulgarians, mostly of peasant origin, fought not only for secession from Romania, but also for the region's incorporation into a future Balkan Federation instead of mere annexation by Bulgaria. As they were friendly to the USSR, Šmeral sought to push them further to the left and also to use them as a means of infiltration into the Romanian Peasant Party, which was increasing in its popularity in those years. Thus, in Romania, Šmeral pursued precisely the two policies that he was resistant to in Czechoslovakia, and which in Czechoslovakia he saw as potentially harmful for proletarian unity. A collaboration with the nationalist organizations, which were deemed national revolutionary, and collaboration with the peasantry. Of course, the alliance of these groups with the proletariat was the essence of Leninism, but Šmeral had reservations about its applicability in Czechoslovakia. In any case, he either did not object to it in the Balkans or actually agreed with these directives in a different context. In Greece, Šmeral led the process of Bolshevizing the party in 1926 and 1927. It was he who oversaw the arrival and work of the so-called Kutvis in Greece. They received this name because many of them had studied at the Moscow-based KUT, the Communist University of the Toilers of the East. And trained in illegal party work, which many Greek comrades did not have, they were able to escape repression during the Pangalos dictatorship of 1926. This resulted in them rising to the leading positions within the party, as the existing legal apparatus had been smashed by the police. Although I believe the rise of Kutvis was more of a product of circumstance than Comintern intention, the latter being the view which dominates in Greek historiography, the leading Kutvi, Costa Eftichiadis, was in constant correspondence with the Šmeral-led Balkan Secretariat and with Šmeral himself, and served as a link between the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Greece and Moscow. It was constantly receiving very detailed instructions from Šmeral. And one of the main characteristics of the group that he led, the Kutvis, was again their support for the policy of self-determination. However, under Šmeral's guidance, they also favored a policy of so-called left democracy, which meant that after another army coup took place in August 1926, the Kutvis, with Šmeral's support and instructions, endorsed the new military regime because of its leftist rhetoric, which dismayed certain members of the Comintern and of the Greek party. And I'll get back to that later on. It will come up again as significant, but again, we see a very important hand of Šmeral in certain events, which seem to be opposite of what he was doing in Czechoslovakia at times. In Yugoslavia, Šmeral was one of the co-authors of the famous Open Letter of 1928, which condemned both left and right factionalism and effectively paved the way for the Stalinization of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. He played a key role in the brokering of the new anti-factional leadership, consisting out of proletarians who were not part of the earlier party divisions. Moreover, this new leadership, consisting mostly of Moscow-educated cadres, completely supported the Leninist prescriptions on self-determination as defined by the Comintern. And we have a similar case as what Molly just mentioned in Czechoslovakia. So you have these Moscow-trained cadres who study there in the late 1920s, becoming parts of the new leaderships in 28, 29. And these leaderships, again, with Šmeral's support, ushered in a new strategy. And this was a strategy of actively subverting Yugoslav territorial integrity and brokering an alliance, again, with the so-called national revolutionary movements, in the hopes that their radicalism, combined with communist tactics, would hasten the incoming socialist revolution. It was in large part thanks to Šmeral's endorsement that they initially rose to power. However, there are also some similarities to earlier Šmeral. So he was also present at meetings of the executive committee of the Comintern, such as the debates with Sima Marković in 1925, who can easily be described as the Yugoslav Šmeral. Marković opposed Leninist self-determination in Yugoslavia, considering it anti-Marxist and detrimental for working-class unity. However, in these debates, Šmeral had a secondary role, and when he was active, his role was primarily conciliatory, not openly anti-Marković. In all three cases, we see Šmeral pursuing policies opposite of what he had argued for in the Czechoslovak context, including national self-determination, alliances with the peasantry, and even the schematic adoption of the Bolshevik organizational model from the mid-1920s, the so-called Bolshevization. However, one important thing to understand here concerns the circumstances of Šmeral's rise within the Third International. On the one hand, his policies within KSČ are condemned around 1924, 1925 for the first time. On the other, we find him precisely at that time rising within the Comintern and leading the newly established Balkan Land Secretariat starting from March 1926. So how do we explain this discrepancy? Why did his downfall in the party mean his rise within the Comintern? In my view, there are two answers. One is Šmeral's support for Stalin, and the other, in my view, far more interesting one, is the Comintern's largely unacknowledged right turn of 1926. Basically, the support for Stalin is pretty straightforward and relatively well known. Šmeral attacked the Zinoviev-led opposition very often, and he was skeptical of Šmeral's earlier leftist course, which, among other things, supported self-determination. And therefore, he was very much open to endorsing Stalin as kind of a more center-leaning candidate. Moreover, Stalin acknowledged this and tried to accommodate Šmeral as well. As I mentioned, you have Sima Marković in Yugoslavia as the rightist, and Stalin criticizes both Šmeral and Marković. But if we compare the two critiques, we see that Stalin is much more lenient towards Šmeral than he is towards Marković, and is actively trying to bring him on his side. All of this points to the main issue, and that is the unacknowledged right turn. So generally, the entire period of Comintern history from 1922 until 28 is considered the era of the United Front policy. While this is true, there were different united fronts in these 6 years, and the one ushered in 1926 was significantly more rightist, that is, more open to compromises with non-communists, workers, and bourgeois parties. And in academic literature, this has only been acknowledged briefly by Norman Laporte in his work on the KPD, and I think it's generally still very much under-researched. But I believe it accurately describes a period between 1926 and 1928, and that it is precisely because of this rightward turn that Stalin needed Šmeral in the Balkans. Although his work in the Balkans showed acceptance of the fundamental tenets of Leninism that he opposed in Czechoslovakia, there was still something of old Šmeral to be seen here. For instance, as I mentioned, his support for the communist endorsement of a capitalist military dictatorship in Greece under the slogan of left democracy shows a clear continuation of his earlier openness to broader political alliances with non-communists. Similarly, in Yugoslavia, he was actually one of the brokers of the reconciliation of Sima Marković with the leftists who more actively supported self-determination, which even resulted in Marković returning to the position of the General Secretary in 1926. So although he supported self-determination in principle, the Yugoslav party nearly completely abandoned it in practical day-to-day affairs under the Šmeral-supported, reinstated leadership of Marković. So to conclude, what do we make of all of these? These, of course, are preliminary conclusions, but I would argue that we should begin considering the possibility of there being different Šmerals in different contexts. Either Šmeral opportunistically agreed to pursue the Comintern line, which he did not agree with, or he genuinely thought that in the Balkans, unlike in Czechoslovakia, this line was workable. After all, the material conditions in the Balkans were far different than in his country of origin, but also arguably more similar to revolutionary Russia, as far as the numerical dominance of the peasantry was concerned. It is thus easy to conceive of a situation in which he agreed with the Leninist prescriptions for the Balkans, while disapproving of them in Central Europe, especially in line with his earlier idea that perhaps different communist parties should follow their different paths based on local conditions. In any case, I hope that this significant and often neglected episode of Šmeral's life helps problematize and reshuffle the traditional narrative regarding his activity in the international communist movement. After all, he led the Balkan Land Secretariat for 3 years as an already politically mature individual, and his engagement there cannot be overlooked nor underestimated. Moreover, I believe it calls for further research not only into Šmeral, but into Comintern itself, as his period in the Balkan Secretariat overlaps with, as I mentioned, the International's important but overlooked right turn in the second half of the 1920s. Thank you very much for your attention.
Tak, děkuji, Stefane, za velmi...
Thank you very much, Stefan, for this very interesting contribution. Thank you also for respecting the time limit. So we've had 2 more general contributions about the approach of the KSČ to the question of nationalities. Now we will move on more to the Czechoslovak context with the contribution of David Hubený, who will speak about the approach of KSČ to the question of nations and nationalities in a problematic region of the first Czechoslovak Republic.
David Hubený je historik a archivář působící v Národním archivu České republiky. Věnuje se soustavně zejména meziválečnému období, a to jak, řekněme, dělnickému hnutí, tak československé armádě, jak v meziválečném období, tak ale i v období druhé světové války. A mezi jeho četnými studiemi a příspěvky k tomuto období, k těmto 2 obdobím československých dějin, je také zastoupen zájem o právě podkarpatskou Rus. A dnešním příspěvku tedy se bude věnovat vývoji a činnosti KSČ na podkarpatské Rusi v meziválečném období. Prosím vás tedy, abyste se ujal slova a označování časového limitu. Děkuji vám.
Děkuji. Velmi milé kolegyně, vážení kolegové. Váleční zajatci vracející se z Ruska po první světové válce byli mnohdy prvními nositeli zpráv o komunismu.
Dear colleagues, prisoners of war returning from Russia were often the first bearers of news of communism in Subcarpathian Ruthenia, and many later Communist Party leaders active in this region were recruited from their ranks, such as Ivan Mondok, Ivan Lakota, or Pavel Terek, many of whom joined the group of communists of the Russian landscape within the Hungarian Republic of the Councils. The Russian landscape group was followed by the International Socialist Party led by Josef Gatti. And since mid-1920, the party moved towards the Comintern. At the Congress in Stará Ljubovna, the party advocated unification with other communists in the Republic and subsequent entry into the Comintern. The communists of Subcarpathian Ruthenia were among the ardent supporters of Bolshevization. Nationalistically, the Communist Party was initially pro-Russian, but later became pro-Ukrainian. Subcarpathian Ruthenia became a place where the interests of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and other neighbors, and from afar Soviet Russia, clashed, when in 1924 the first evidence emerged that at least some party members were calling for the annexation of the region to the Soviet Union. Moscow's interest in Subcarpathian Ruthenia had already been manifested in the summer of 1920, when during the Polish-Soviet War, alleged telegrams from the ČTK appeared in Uzhgorod about negotiations between France and Hungary on the passage of Hungarian forces through Subcarpathian Ruthenia to help Poland. It is not surprising, therefore, that on 24 October 1920, the Soviet mission in Prague reported that it had a connection with the revolutionary movement in there. In the organizational orders of the interwar Communist Party, Subcarpathian Ruthenia as a whole was never granted any separate organizational status, as this would have contradicted the unity of the International Party. It was only during the Second Republic that Subcarpathian Ruthenia was granted a special status. In fact, it constituted a single-party region for which a certain degree of autonomy in purely local matters was assumed, and given the remoteness of the region and its specificity, this degree of autonomy was even greater in reality. In practice, the party encountered considerable difficulties from the Czechoslovak state authorities. The strong anti-communist setup of the entire state administration in Subcarpathia was due to the fact that its long-standing head was Antonín Rosypal, who had made his name by intervening against the general strike of December 1920 in Kladno region. It is therefore not surprising that this became a target of criticism in the National Assembly. The administrative actions of the civil administration slowed down the building of the party, such as the expulsion of party leaders because they did not have or had lost their Czechoslovak nationality, which was the case, for example, of the secretary of the Subcarpathian region, Eno Seidler, or the Hungarian writer Béla Iles. Yet, in the spring of 1921, there were supposed to be 50,000 to 60,000 party members in Subcarpathian Ruthenia. This extraordinary number was due to the fact that subscribers to certain periodicals and paying members of trade union organizations were also considered party members. Not surprisingly, by 1923, the county already had only 9,000 members, and the numbers continued to decline, so that by 1924 it was only 6,000, and in the late 1920s it was somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000. In fact, it became a kind of tradition in Subcarpathian Ruthenia to hear regular reports that the Communist Party was eroding, losing members, and yet the same reports acknowledged the party's achievements. I quote, "Undoubtedly, the Communist Party has the most perfectly developed organization of the intelligence service so that the communist leadership is informed in good time of all serious events." End of quote. Thanks to its persistent work, the Communist Party usually achieved victorious results in elections. The recipe was simple, as Ivan Lokota described it. Our comrades went day after day from house to house, agitating everywhere. The party was not only active before the elections, and various delegations of deputies and senators often went to Subcarpathian and Ruthenia and visited the people directly in their home. By the second half of the 1920s, the party was quite established, and there was great satisfaction with the regional agitation and publicity committee, which supplied the cells with materials, and party education was also thriving. The Uzhgorod region could thus boldly show repeated interest in the Eastern Slovakian region, where many Ruthenians lived at the time. Nationality politics was very important in Subcarpathian Ruthenia, but mainly complicated, as Ivan Mondok said at the Fifth Party Congress. I quote, "We ourselves in Western Ukraine did not know what we were. Are we Russians, Ruthenians, or Ruski with a soft E? In a word, we didn't really know what we were." End of quote. According to Mondok, the Subcarpathian communists themselves only began to address the national question after the mid-1920s, at the urging of the Communist Party of Western Ukraine. However, even the Communist Party headquarters did not pay attention to the issue and called the Subcarpathian Party various names, as there were various names used for Subcarpathian Ruthenia, such as Podkarpatska Rus, Zakarpatska Ukraina, Podkarpatska Ukraina, and so on. The mention of the West Ukrainian communists in Mondok's speech was not accidental, as they had been influencing the Subcarpathian communists for a considerable period of time. So, the Communist Party headquarters found it hard to bear the fact that they were not receiving regular reports from Subcarpathian Ruthenia, as they did from other regions. The Communist Party of Western Ukraine, with its headquarters in Kharkiv, was to direct the illegal activities of sections not only in Subcarpathian Ruthenia, but also in Halych and Bessarabia. Its special agitation and propaganda centers were located in Kharkiv. Among the graduates of the Kharkiv schools, one can find prominent party leaders. In the first half of the 1930s, however, the headquarters of the Communist Party of Ukraine began to enforce authoritatively regular activity reports on the region. The turn of the 1920s and 1930s found the party overwhelmed with activities such as the issuance of instructions for a possible civil war in April 1930, and soon secret secretariats for clandestine work in the barracks. At the same time, however, the party was plagued by low membership activity, and sometimes did not even take advantage of obvious opportunities for activity, such as May Day, August 1st, elections to the factories, etc. However, as quickly as the party fell into trouble, it was just as quickly able to whip itself up into large-scale activities, and in 1931 had already brought an increase in the activities of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, which led a large-scale strike movement in Subcarpathia. The party had direct actions and its specialists, such as Senator Ivan Lakota. Not surprisingly, the party soon had to fear its dissolution and repeatedly prepare to go underground. However, the security forces showed such knowledge of the communist movement and its intentions that in some places, such as Uzhgorod in the first half of the 1930s, the party organizations broke up completely or reduced their activities as party members distrusted each other and suspected each other of being confederates. The disheveled state of the party in the 1930s was also reflected in the numerical development of the membership of the region, from almost 3,000 members in October 1932 to 722 in January 1934. It subsequently rose to 2,000. In spring of 1937, the Communist Party in the region had over 2,000 members, and in June 1937, it had only 1,700 members. However, on January 1938, it had already over 3,000 members. The problems described above, however, did not affect the electoral results of the party, which had earned its success through hard educational work, as it consistently took care of the knowledge and professional training of its political representatives, including municipal officials as well as ordinary members. The party not only took actions in response to the current situation, but also created and built its positions in a planned and long-term manner, including the preparation of satellite organizations. The change of the course of the party after the 7th Congress of the Comintern was not without problems and time-consuming training of functionaries at the turn of 1935 and 36. From the point of view of the state administration, however, it was the unannounced meetings that were prosecuted. Along national lines, the party continued to pursue a Ukrainian direction in the 1930s, but was careful not to anger the Russian and Ruthenian direction. This approach paid off, especially during the Second Republic, when the party could freely cooperate with the pro-Russian tendencies, although, of course, the introduction of Ukrainian was preferred at some meetings. The events of May 1938 naturally found a positive response at the meetings of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia in Subcarpathian and Ruthenia. At the KSČ event, speakers of all nationalities, naturally warned of the Hitlerian threat, recalled the Hungarian atrocities, and criticized the activities of the Hungarian leaders. In places, the state administration welcomed and appreciated these communist meetings and declarations, even regarded and praised them. However, the adherence to the state and its defense did not mean that security forces and administrative authorities did not continue to suppress the communist movement. And, for example, on 27 May 1938, the regional party periodical Karpatská Pravda was banned for 2 months. The local communists, but even the rest of the population, apart from the struggles of the security forces against Hungarian and Polish terrorists in 1938 to 39, were not given the opportunity to show their determination to defend the state through action. At a meeting in Ninshava on 4 September 1938, Oleksandr Borkanyu concluding his speech, I quote, "If we defend the Republic, we are not defending the Czechs and the Czech masters, but ourselves, our children, our women, democracy, and the freedom of the working people. Better to die immediately on the battlefield than to crawl under the fascist yoke." End of quote. Borkanyu expressed many things very precisely. Yes, the Czechoslovak regime is not perfect, and in many ways it does not suit us, but it is livable and it is worth fighting for. No wonder, then, that during the Second World War, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia and its Subcarpathian representatives until the autumn of 1944 envisaged the return of this territory to union with Czechoslovakia. If we wanted to speak of the period following 1944, I'd need to make another speech, so I end here and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, David, for this very interesting contribution
konkrétní situace jednání KSČ v těchto otázkách, zejména podkarpatské Rusy, přináší skutečně velice zajímavé nové poznatky. Nyní se přeneseme do období po roce 1940.
Now we are going to speak about the period after 1945. Our next speaker is Smetana, head of the Department of Global Conflicts and Their Consequences at the Institute for Contemporary History of the Czech Academy of Sciences. He also lectures at the Faculty of Social Sciences of Charles University. His research interests include the history of international politics and diplomacy during the Second World War and the first phase of the Cold War. Also the British foreign policy in the 20th century. He is the author and co-editor of many publications. I'd like to mention his monography, Neither War Nor Peace, The Great Powers, Czechoslovakia and Central Europe in 7 dramas on the threshold of the Second World War and the Cold War, was published in 2016. There's also the collective monography he co-edited together with Mark Kramer, entitled Imposing, Maintaining and Tearing Open the Iron Curtain, the Cold War and East Central Europe, 1945 to 1989, published in Harvard Cold War Studies, a series by Lexington Books in 2014. Today, however, he will be speaking about, he will present his contribution entitled Illusion and Grim Warnings, Officials of the KSČ and Their Path to Power in the Report of American and British Diplomats. Vítek, the floor is yours. And please switch on your microphone. Switch on your microphone once again. We can. Yes. Now it works. Thank you very much for these kind words of introduction, and I hope you can see the picture I am sharing. Dear colleagues, the ascension of Communist Party representatives to key positions of power in liberated Czechoslovakia was from the beginning closely watched by representatives of both Western powers. Due to the all-round friendly policy of the Czechoslovak government and President Beneš towards the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia was considered a litmus test of Soviet goodwill and willingness to cooperate as opposed to be dominated. This made the policy of the local Communist Party, its leaders and its goals all the more thoroughly scrutinized by the numerous US and British embassies. At the same time, numerous illusions influenced by the views of non-Communist Party leaders permeated their reports and predictions. At the same time, reports from Prague on the policy of the Communist Party, the Czechoslovak Republic, had a decisive influence on American policy towards Czechoslovakia. The communist rise to power is still today explained in the context of the alleged ostentatious disinterest of the Western powers in the fate of this part of Europe. This is a false and easily refutable conclusion. It must be said that the Americans, in particular, made fundamental mistakes in the years 46 to 48, which resulted precisely from an incorrect analysis of the policies of the KSČ and its sources. Things are going well here, wrote American Ambassador Lawrence Steinhardt. We can see him in this picture arriving in Prague. And he continues in May 1947. So he wrote, things are going well here. He wrote this to his brother-in-law, William Rosenblatt. He continues, so I'm quite optimistic about the future of Czechoslovakia. This certainly candid private assessment was consistent with dispatches sent at the time from the Prague embassy to the State Department. They spoke of the stabilizing of the situation, the consolidation of democratic mechanisms, the waning popularity of the Communist Party, the repeated political defeats of communists at various levels of government, and the rejection of radical communist proposals in parliament. Looking at the whole area of Central and Eastern Europe, it seems as if Czechoslovakia was indeed at that time moving into an increasingly exceptional position, while elsewhere, Hungary, Poland, in Bulgaria, Romania, the situation was rapidly deteriorating and the activities of non-communist parties were systematically suppressed. In Czechoslovakia, the development seemed to be taking the opposite trend. Lawrence Steinhardt, who in previous years had served in the most diplomatically exposed posts of ambassador to the Soviet Union and Turkey, we can see him here in with General Harmon in 45 and Jan Masaryk. So he rejected talk of an iron curtain on Czechoslovakia's western border. And he persuaded government officials during his February visit to the United States, editors of key newspapers and members of the prestigious Council on Foreign Relations, that Czechoslovakia was on the right track, was not moving towards communism, but was on the contrary making progress in every respect and should be encouraged in every possible way, including positive press articles. It should be added that the Central Intelligence Group, the predecessor of the CIA, came to similar conclusions in a March 1947 report to President Truman on anti-communist tendencies in Czechoslovakia. It's interesting that Steinhardt himself referred to the Czechoslovak government as communist-dominated. However, he was clearly delusional about the Czech and Slovak communists. He repeatedly described them as, for the most part, sincere patriots. Behind all the problems, in his view, was a radical minority whose strength he estimated at only 10%. At the same time, Steinhardt, at the head of a diplomatic apparatus of more than 100 people in the American embassy, housed in 2 palaces, luxurious palaces, clearly overestimated his own importance. He believed, for example, that he had considerable influence over the communist minister of the Interior, Václav Nosek, with whom he was, I quote, on very friendly terms, as he often went partridge and pheasant hunting with him. Among the moderate communists, he counted not only the very sensible Vladimir Klementis, with whom he maintained, I quote, very close personal relations, but also Klement Gottwald, not only in his post-election report of June 1946, as is often mentioned, but even as late as the end of September of the following year. Steinhardt felt, I quote, great respect or even affection for the communist prime minister, and when, according to his observations, Václav Kopecký also showed moderate tendencies in the autumn of 1946, the American ambassador expected that Gottwald would soon find it all the easier to deal with the extremists in the party. It did not happen. Yet Steinhardt still concluded from his conversations with Gottwald in early October 1947 that the Prime Minister's idea of communism consisted more in state socialism and the equalization of class differences than in a Soviet-style communism. He then confided to US senators in late September 1947 that he preferred to deal with Gottwald rather than feelinger, because I quote, the latter will do what Moscow tells him, as if Gottwald did not do so. This analysis of the strength and intentions of the Communist Party has unfortunately influenced American politics. Already in the autumn 1946, Secretary of State Barnes decided to freeze the disbursement of loans, except for UNRRA aid, and negotiations on others, in response to the apparent unwillingness to compensate American citizens for nationalized property, anti-American attacks in the left-wing press, and above all, the servilely pro-Soviet posturing on the international scene, specifically the applause of Czechoslovak delegates to Ondřej Vyshinsky's words about US dollar imperialism at the Paris Peace Conference in August 1946. Steinhardt himself recommended this policy of economic coercion as a suitable tool to moderate the Prague government, in which the communists played a major role. He also talked the American ministries out of granting commodity credits, a line he followed in the autumn of 1947, despite the gradually growing opposition of his Czech friends. At the time, for example, he assured a large group of American senators and members of the House of Representatives during their visit to Prague that the popularity of the Communist Party was declining, and estimated its result in the upcoming elections at 20 to 30%. At the end of October, he wrote to the State Department, I quote, "In my opinion, the best way to save democracy in Czechoslovakia is to not lift a finger until the government sobers up, wakes up from its illusions about what it can expect from the Soviet Union, and realizes that Santa Claus expects children to behave for a little longer than Christmas Eve." End of quote. If we develop this metaphor of Steinhardt, we can unfortunately conclude that already in the run-up to Christmas 1947, it began to become apparent how much Grandfather Frost, in particular, was trying to do in the case of Czechoslovakia. It turned out that the Soviet Union was fulfilling, beyond expectations, the promised grain deliveries promised in place of the Marshall Plan, which was, of course, water on the mill of communist propaganda presented in the press, namely that America, the West, was again letting Czechoslovakia down, as in September 1938, and the only one helping was the Soviet Union. The American diplomats' predictions that the country would be hit by crisis and hunger, for which the communists, as the decisive force in the government, would be responsible, did not come true. So the embassy hastily devised a positive alternative. It was to be a cultural treaty, the first of its kind that the Americans would sign. But by the February crisis, nothing had been approved. Similarly with the forthcoming trade treaty, or with the effort to declassify and publish before the planned spring elections the documents on what really happened in May 1945 with the liberation of Prague, a cause from whose distorted interpretation in terms of the always treacherous West, which let the Prague uprising bleed indifferently, the communists extracted considerable political capital as late as January 1948. At the same time, it cannot be accepted that the cessation of economic aid to Czechoslovakia merely reflected the American decision to continue to provide American economic aid exclusively to the countries of Western Europe and to de facto write off the Eastern communizing part of it. Evidence of this is found not only in the Marshall Plan, with its open door to Eastern European countries, but also the $25 million loan to Hungary in the spring of 1947 against the wishes of Ambassador Arthur Schoenfeld, and in the loan to Poland for the purchase of US Army surplus, which the Polish government was able to draw on during 1947. Towards Czechoslovakia, however, the influential Steinhardt asserted his view, which was the wrong policy. Here we can see a picture with President Hoover and Edward Beneš. Now, a few words about British diplomacy. British diplomacy was reserved about the American policy of economic pressure against Czechoslovakia, and its disapproval grew as time went on. British diplomats regarded this American approach as an ill-conceived move, as it would damage the supporters of the West in Czechoslovakia and only give the communists more arguments to attack it. The British therefore supported Czechoslovakia in 1945 and 46 by providing loans in November 1945, amounting to £5 million, which is about $20 million, and in December 1946, £2.5 million to buy British Army surpluses, which was about 1/5 the amount of the loan stopped shortly before by the Americans. However, in the context of the economic crisis of early 1947, when the Labour government was forced to take the painful decisions to stop financial support to the Greek and Turkish governments and to withdraw from India and Palestine, there was no more scope for aid to Czechoslovakia. The overwhelming victory of the communists in the May 1946 elections caused an unpleasant surprise in government circles in London. No one really expected 40%. Orm Sargent, permanent Under-Secretary of State at the Foreign Office, commented, I quote, I expect the communists will now take the offensive and seize power, though perhaps for a time they will maintain the facade of the coalition and the Beneš presidency. Ambassador Philip Nichols, who had served with the Czechoslovak government since 1941, however, in the days that followed, tempered any alarmist predictions. He saw the reasons for the communist victory mainly in the defense of people's own interests, that is, interests by people who had occupied important positions or acquired considerable property from the hands of national committees and other administrative bodies since May 1945. The communists played the most important role in these transactions, and this was particularly true of the land reform. In subsequent correspondence with Foreign Minister and Stefan, he agreed on the need to express the utmost interest in the future of Czechoslovakia and to support it in every way. Levin really stressed this, that it's an essential matter for Britain. Nichols was under no illusions about the communists. His characterization of the communist prime minister was much more apt than that of Steinhardt. Nichols pointed out that Gottwald's interest in good relations with Western countries was completely subordinate to his main goal, which was to turn Czechoslovakia into a communist state. Nichols did not dispute that Gottwald was a patriotic Czechoslovakian, but he also emphasized that he was a lifelong communist, trained in Moscow, and for years also a senior Comintern official who would not budge an inch in his quest to maximize communist control of Czechoslovakia. The key and for the time being open question for the future was therefore whether he and other communist members of the government would allow parliamentary democracy to survive in Czechoslovakia so that their party could be defeated in the next election in 2 years' time. It was from this realistic analysis, as well as from Czechoslovakia's unequivocally pro-Soviet stance on the international scene in the context of growing contradictions on the East-West axis, that British geopolitical caution emanated. That's why London discouraged the French government from concluding an alliance treaty with Poland and Czechoslovakia, so that a country with a strong communist party would not be drawn into the emerging Eastern European alliance network. British diplomats perceived the ambivalence of Czechoslovak developments during 1947. Thus, at the end of May, Ambassador Nichols at Prague Castles telling President Beneš that Czechoslovakia has made significant progress in all respects since the war, perhaps the greatest in Europe along with Belgium, but at the same time he warned of the apparently growing influence of the secret police and communist efforts to politically infiltrate the army. It can be easily documented that in the field of public relations, Czechoslovakia was one of the countries where British diplomacy expended its greatest efforts and resources in 1947. And it was in the consciousness of the growing communist radicalization and in an effort to keep Czechoslovakia as much as possible in its position between West and East and to prevent its slipping behind the curtain, in the words of Prime Minister Attlee, that British diplomacy decided at the 12th hour in January 1948 to send Lenin's Private Secretary Pearson Dixon to Prague as the new ambassador with a personal message to President Beneš to say what he wanted Britain to do to preserve his country's freedom. However, this most significant attempt by the West to throw sinking Czechoslovakia a lifeline went unused when on the 10th of February, the president categorically ruled out any threat to Czechoslovak democracy and merely wished for a deepening of trade. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Velice zajímavého podnětného příspěvku.
Very interesting contribution.
And here we will discuss international activity of KSČ using the example of Indonesia and Indonesian leftist immigrants in the 1960s. Marta Edith Holečková is a scientist at the Institute of Contemporary History of the Academy of Science. She dedicates her work to the unofficial culture in the period of normalization. In her thesis, she discussed the University of 17 November and its place in the Czechoslovak educational system and society, which was also published as the story of forgotten university in the Charles University Press. So I would like to pass the floor to Marta about Forgotten Internationalism. That's the title of her contribution. Thank you for passing me the floor. I will try to briefly point out what were the international relations of Czechoslovakia and developing countries, what were these relations based on, and what were the obstacles they faced. And I will use a specific example at the end of my presentation to illustrate what I will say, and a good illustration of the deaths and streets this policy could get into. To start with, I would remind you of the fact that Czechoslovakia was following the trend of interest in developing countries and in the third world, which came from the Soviet Union, where in the mid 1950s there was a radical turn. The first reason for this was Stalin's death, which opened space for interest in these countries, which no one was interested in until then, because they seemed insignificant in the political battlefield. And then another milestone was the Bandung Conference in 1959, where representatives of Asian and African countries met and declared their independence on the bipolar world. And they presented their effort to be present in the international field as a newly forming force. So Czechoslovakia enters this field, and in a number of cases, its international policy is based on the experience they had so far, or the experience they gained in the interwar period. But in some cases, such as in the case of Indonesia, Czechoslovakia creates new policy and discovers new interests, new worlds unknown until then in this context. Indonesia became an interesting and strategic player in the post-war period. Let me remind you of the post-war development. To start with, it was a Dutch colony for over 300 years, a very large territory with multitudes of islands, a very culturally diversified country. And during the period of emancipation and the efforts for liberation, independence, and the creation of Indonesian nation, so the bearer of these ideas was the first Indonesian president, Sukarno, who based his policy on diversity while also giving the people one major idea, basing Indonesia on the idea of one nation, one identity, which would be something he could then work on and become independent of the Dutch former colonists and become a force in the region as well, especially Malaysia, a former British colony. So it was important to build one national identity. Following the end of the Japanese occupation in August 1945, Sukarno declares an independent state. But it wasn't until 1948 that the Netherlands capitulated and the newly created state could become more visible in the international field. In mid-1950s, Indonesia became a priority country of different countries, including the Czechoslovak international policy. Sukarno came in the late 50s to Czechoslovakia, and international bilateral agreements were signed at the time. International cooperation was established. Czechoslovaks sent people to Indonesia to help to build the country. They sent military equipment, helping the creation of the Indonesian military forces. And this collaboration included not only help in building infrastructure, but it also entailed an agreement on bilateral exchange of students, meaning that Czechoslovak students could go and study to Indonesia, the less frequent version of this, and Indonesian students could go and study at Czechoslovak universities. The first students came in 1957 and 58. And let me remind you that the idea of the student exchange was based on the premise of it being advantageous for both sides. Giving education to the Indonesians here was considered as creating a network of, say, contact persons in Indonesia that could then help strengthen Czechoslovak interests in Indonesia. The idea of student exchanges was also an explicit part of Sukarno's policy, who wanted to create a new elite of the newly created state. He wanted to send large numbers of young people abroad to study, thus creating a new generation that would support him and the new elite of the new state. So it was not only Czechoslovakia building terrain for entering the country and growing its interest there, but it was mutual. We have to mention the selection of the students, how that was made, but in general, as you can also see on the map, Indonesia is a very fragmented country. So the idea was to choose people from as many regions as possible. Also, there is different language on each island, and oftentimes these are not related language groups. So there was to be a regional representation. Also, it was required that the students had contacts to local youth organizations, have graduated from high school, and of course they had to have some personal qualities because they were going to a very distant country also in terms of culture and society, habits, etc. So it would be a very demanding and difficult thing to do. So there was some analysis of how suitable the students are. So until the end of 1950s, the only option to travel was by boat. There was no flight between Jakarta and Prague. And it was, of course, also very costly. The cost of the travel and studies was paid from different resources, be it governmental or state stipends, or by the Youth Association of the UN, or they covered the expenses themselves. So this is a picture of President Sukarno, and the left picture is of his visit in Czechoslovakia in the early 1960s. I mentioned the technical help, which also included military training. We have two documents related to this. One is a book by Josef Kebza, who in his book wanted to describe different aspects of these relations. It's not an amazing literary work, but it is interesting to read because he describes the environment, and it's also interesting that a co-production film was made, and it's called Action Kalimantan. Kalimantan is a name for the Borneo island, and it's real Indonesian pilots acting there, and also some known Czechoslovak actors such as Martin Růžek, who was also a part of the cast of the film. The film is freely available. So it is interesting to see the ongoing fights that went on beyond 1948 and Czechoslovak participation in this. When the Indonesian students arrived to Czechoslovakia, there was a sort of infrastructure made available for them. The first step they had to do was a medical check. Sometimes they had to quarantine themselves for a period of 1 to 3 months to prevent spread of some tropical disease and so on. And then they were sent to educational centers where they studied Czech language to master it pretty well, so to be able to study at Czech universities. When the University of 17th November was created established in 1961, it became a sort of backbone for the international students. And it also provided the care that these students were supposed to be given to help them to adapt to the local society environment, meet their needs in the academic field, but also in the daily life. So once the students learned Czech well enough, they could continue studying at the University of 17th November, choose some of the study programs that it offered, or they could pass the test and start studying at another university. Regardless of which, they would still remain sort of roofed by University of the 17th November that helped them, but also sort of controlled them. So what was the numbers? What were the numbers of the students present here? At the maximum, it was 100 people, and the preferred subject of study was medicine, economy, and then some art studies offered by the drama department of the Charles University. I will mention an important milestone in Indonesian history, the year of 1960, which is when there was an effort to make a communist coup d'etat in September 1960 in Indonesia. This brought about the fall of Sukarno and the arrival of Suharto, a general who was very strict and the retaliating actions turned into great chaos, which lasted for over 6 months and caused a number of victims, with estimates of roughly 500,000 of victims. So the policy failed totally, the policy of Sukarno's. And this is a time when we have here a group of Indonesian students scared in chaos because they don't really understand what's going on at home. It was very difficult to get any information. It took a long time for the mail to arrive, and they were relying on information from the Indonesian embassy. This radical change in Indonesia policy, of course, impacted all Indonesian communities around the world. In the Czechoslovak case, it's perhaps 85%, but in the global scale, it's an entire generation that includes students, but also businessmen, diplomats, etc. And it's many thousands people who at one moment became forced immigrants. From the global point of view, it's a widely studied issue. We speak of the lost generation. And I believe that in this context, it is important to document well the Czechoslovak case, because the group here represents a part of a wider issue, and it can also point at the limits of international cooperation. Although no one wanted the students to remain here for long, it was to be a student exchange. Now the Czechoslovak government was in a position where it had to protect these people and support them, had to keep them in its territory and provide them with a certain status, be it a status of a refugee or a person without nationality, but in any case, a person under the protection of the Czechoslovak state, because by sending them back, it would mean endangering their lives. Majority of those students were supporters of President Sukarno. Until these days, they speak of him in superlatives, and it was impossible for them to think to accept a compromise regarding the situation at home in Indonesia. Most of them were firm in their opinion, in their attitudes, and they didn't want to express an obligatory agreement with the new chief of state. The terror was aimed at people who sympathized with communism, and often this was a way of solving local conflicts or personal conflicts even. So anyone who could be considered as a sympathizer of the Communist Party could be endangered if sent back. Here you can see a group of Indonesian students in language center in Dobruška. If you look at the man in the middle with glasses, he was the cultural attaché, and he was one of the persons who also remained in Czechoslovakia following the coup d'etat in 1960. Here, these are celebration of the 1st May in 1968. Another picture documents the fact that many of these people had their own strategies of how to remain in Czechoslovakia, be it by marrying a Czech person. This was widely criticized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also by the communist committees. Nevertheless, it was happening, and in the case of the Indonesian students, it was one of the ways of obtaining a status and a permanent residency in Czechoslovakia. So I mentioned that students returning from a socialist country could be threatened in life. And we don't have many cases documented. A student who returned was Leonard Tobing, who studied economy here, married a Czech girl and returned with her to Indonesia, and then in the 1990s became an ambassador in Czechoslovakia. I don't know what led to the fact that he survived his return to Indonesia. Probably he had some influential links or connections in the newly established elite. But in 2014, he was awarded the Gracias Prize award awarded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And one of the bridges made between Czech Republic and Indonesia is the fact that thanks to his activity, the Prague Zoo has this beautiful animal, the Komodo dragon. As you probably remember, last year it was widely discussed whether we should accept a Chinese panda or a Taiwanese animal. So even animals can become, parts of diplomatic efforts. So having this Komodo animal proves a certain fact. Thank you for your attention.
Marta, thank you very much for this very interesting contribution. This is a really nice example of internationalist relationships and how they contributed not only to economic relationships, but there were also consequences in the field of science, including Egyptology and archaeology. Our archaeologists were able to do interesting research in Egypt. So now is the time for the Q&A, for the discussions. Many thanks to all presenters for the contributions. We have received some questions in the chat from our attendees who are watching us on YouTube. And I suppose afterwards you may also have questions for each other. So hopefully we will have time for the discussion among yourselves, among the presenters. So those who are watching us, feel free to still send in your questions and comments. So I'm going to read the question and say to whom it is addressed. So the first question is from Jakub Verba, and it is addressed to Molly Pucci. Thanks to Molly Pucci for a great contribution that showed us the USSR and the Comintern as the forerunners of the solution to the national question in the Czechoslovakia, which they undoubtedly were. But how crucial were the older traditions going back in Czechoslovakia and Austria-Hungary before 1921 and 1918 in the question of internationalism? In other words, to what extent was it then also formed from within the party? Molly, please.
Okay, thank you. So the question is about sort of the images of internationalism that carried over from the Habsburg period as well as I understood it. Yeah, so basically, I think part of the issue is how to sort of create a new, I suppose, image of what, you know, sort of a unifying image. And Jakob and I have talked about this because he presents on this issue of Jan Hus as sort of one of the major images that comes up of, you know, of the sort of in trying to bring together these national traditions. I think it's also, I would say, and I'm working on this because I think it's a big question for, I would say, cultural policy, is this international sort of experiments in internationalism. And it takes a lot of forms. One is really this sort of Central European image. So building the party as a Central European image. And you see this showing up in the newspapers, you know, sort of, you know, the I suppose the, you know, bringing together Germany and the Czech lands and Hungary and Ukraine under the umbrella of Central Europe. You see a lot of translation projects in this period, right? So people translating from these languages into Czech and Czech into these. So again, it's sort of on the, I would say, the Soviet model. It's not so much assimilating the nationalities as it is creating a new language of internationalism that brings them in conversation with each other. So expanding the sense of what national is by bringing, you know, the, you know, Slovak words into Czech and bringing German words, right? So sort of creating this much more diverse sense of what the national is, right? One of the big criticisms they had of the first Czechoslovak Republic is that that Czech really dominated in education and in language policy, and that it should be a much more diverse, you know, cultural experience that integrates these national minorities. And the last thing I would say is there's a lot of experiments with things like Esperanto and Ido, which is a really interesting aspect of trying to find literally a language for internationalism that would not favor one of the national groups, but would actually be sort of a non-national scientific language. And this is actually in the Comintern in general, they have a lot of sort of these experiments with artificial languages. So a lot of this stuff just plays itself out without resolving, you know, anything, but it's sort of these various experiments in multinational culture building and multinational state building. I mean, the Unity Congress is held in 9 languages, right? So you have sort of the, you know, they allow each group to speak its own language, and it's supposed to be this continuation of these multi-countries. So I would say it's not resolved as so much as it is experimented with in this period.
Dobře, děkuji. Já bych jenom možná v téhle souvislosti řekl.
Thank you very much. I'd like to add that Esperanto is a topic researched by Bernhard Struck, our colleague, who is now in Scotland. So that may be inspiring to have a look at his work. If you feel that you would like to comment, please feel free to do so. Just, we have received the instruction not to use symbols. Just raise your hand and you can speak on the camera. Next question is from Jakub Verba, and it is addressed to David Hubený. Thanks also to David Hubený. Could that pro-Czechoslovakian politics be found in some hints before 1935? Did they subsequently confirm their support in the local elections of 1938, as in Prague, for example? David. Yes, we could find some hints, I guess, but in the first half of the 1930s, the party was very much focused on dealing with the big economic crisis and different struggles, strikes, marches of the unemployed. So overall, in Subcarpathian Ruthenia, the party was perceived as an element that was against the state. And then there was the turn in the mid-30s, and it was a surprise. And it was hard to adjust to it, not just for the partisans, but also for representatives of the state administration. There was a case where the communists were allowed to have a meeting, it was approved, they had posters, but the policemen, as soon as they saw these communist posters, they started to destroy them because it was communist. So until 1935, 1936, the party was seen as anti-state, even though here and there we can find some appreciation of the activities of the central body of the KSČ in favor of the Subcarpathian Ruthenia, or sometimes there were things that were appreciated, for example, that a bridge was built, a school was built, or a road, but other things were criticized, like too many Czech officials, Czech clerks in state administration, or domination of Czech education in Subcarpathian Ruthenia. So there was an ambivalence. The Ruthenians were, on the one hand, they were happy to be part of Czechoslovakia, but Czechoslovakia had its issues as well. There were economic difficulties and cultural difficulties. It took some time to create schools, to find qualified teachers, and to have educated people graduating from these schools, to have people who could lead Subcarpathian Ruthenia and to acquire autonomy. Communists very actively complained about how lengthy it was, and that the aid to the hungry, to the peasants, to the unemployed was too slow. So the reality of state finance is what it is. Thank you very much. Now we have two questions from the English channel. Yajush23 is the person who is asking the question, a general question to everyone.
About the writers and the publishing industry in the socialist Czechoslovakia. The beginning of this thesis is about the author's relationship toward the regime, starting with the Klement Gottwald's inauguration into the presidential office, probably. Is it right, or should I start in 1920s? What should be the right approach? So he's asking on your suggestions. Takže pokud byste někdo poradili,
so if you have any suggestions to this doctoral student, where to start?
Nebo spisovatelů vůči socialismu a komunismu, tady má začít v roce 48 nebo již ve 20. letech.
So should the student start in 1948 or in the 1920s, perhaps?
Ano, pane Hubený.
Yes, Mr. Hubený. Definitely in the 1920s, Ivan Olbracht, for example, is a great example with his works about Subcarpathian Ruthenia, for example, which I like very much. I totally agree, of course. The Communist Party was very much supported by the literary elite of the First Republic. And there was the manifesto of the 7 writers or personalities of the intellectual left who left the Communist Party. So there was also a criticism, but there was a very intense interaction in the 20s and 30s. So the students should definitely start in the 1920s. Great, thank you very much. So Jajuš, 23, you should really start in the 1920s, or you should at least consider this option.
Byl zpracován nějaké úvodní kapitole, která postihuje už to meziválečné období. Dále se ptá...
The interwar period should at least be mentioned. The next question is from our colleague from the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes, Vojtěchovský. What were the main factors for the recognition of a group as a nation in the view of KSČ in the interwar period? Any clear differences between the approach of KSČ and the USSR?
Thank you very much for the question. I would start by emphasizing that the national question has to be seen, and I really cannot stress this enough, that the national question has to be seen within a global strategy of world revolution. So the entire idea of the Leninist conception of self-determination stems from Lenin's analysis of global capitalism. We all know the kind of cliche, of Russia as the weakest link in the capitalist chain, but this was just like one famous phrase from a much broader analysis, which was really interested in examining global capitalist trends and seeing how they can be applied in order to further the cause of communist revolution. And then the self-determination comes in because what Lenin observed was that in the peripheral countries of capitalism, and this is particularly relevant for places like Russian Empire or the Balkans and so on, the national question in these effectively pre-industrial societies most manifests itself as the peasant question, because you always have this divide. Obviously Bohemia was more developed, so this happened in the 19th century, but you have this divide, right, where the urbanized proletarian population is of one ethnicity and the bourgeois population, of course, whereas the peasantry living in the countryside is of a different ethnicity, and that only changes through industrialization and migration to cities. And the idea was that then when these people are articulating national demands, they are basically articulating their class demands as the peasantry. So then once you come to applying this general rule to concrete situations like Soviet Russia or Czechoslovakia, basically there are several issues at hand. So first of all, within the Soviet Union, and there's plenty of literature about this, the idea is essentially, Molly was mentioning the affirmative action empire. So there's essentially
So we are freezed now.
And how to formulate a nation. Sorry?
You are freezed now for a few seconds. So, so if you can repeat your last sentence.
Yeah, so I was saying there's essentially a whole set of commissions, and this is a work of ethnographers, of politicians, of theoreticians within the Soviet Union, all of whom kind of try to understand what makes up a nation and then to define the nations within the Soviet Union, which also kind of changes through the 1920s and 30s. On the other hand, you have a similar thing, I would say, not only for KSČ, but for the Comintern in general, except this is done at the levels of parties. So you have constant kind of debates on the national question within these parties. So So obviously here you don't have a broader societal debate because these are not the ruling parties, but you have debates within parties that kind of try to make sense of this and essentially try to apply these Leninist principles to understand who fulfills the conditions to be a nation and who does not. And the key document here, especially starting from about 1922, 1923, is Stalin's Marxism and the National Question, which he wrote all the way in 1912, and which was at the root of his becoming the kind of expert for nationalities. The way, so there was no really, I would say, general principle on who becomes a nation or who doesn't. For instance, and a colleague, Dr. Hubený, was mentioning this as well. With Ruthenia, you have these regions, for instance, which are claimed by the Soviet Union. And what I find particularly interesting about them is that initially they are intended as springboards for revolutions. Obviously, later on, this becomes a kind of a typically redentist territorial claim. But initially, the claim against Ruthenia or, for instance, Bessarabia or Poland has less to do with kind of reclaiming imperial lands and more with hoping that upheaval in these places would then spread to the centers of these states, from Bessarabia to Bucharest, from Ruthenia to Prague, and that this would result in revolutions in these places. After all, you have to keep in mind, the country is called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, right? There is no ethnic denominator anywhere in those four words. So, if we close our eyes and forget everything we know, you could imagine a country named Union of Soviet Socialist Republics existing virtually anywhere in the world. It's not related to a geographical area or an ethnic group like Czech Republic or, Croatia, Germany, and so on. It's a state that could exist anywhere, and it was intentionally intended to be a Soviet Socialist Republic, which is what Zinoviev was talking about very much. So one issue I think that remains kind of to be researched is precisely when this moves from a springboard to revolution to a sort of irredentism, where you essentially just have an expansion of Soviet territory. But in general, I think that to understand certain views in certain situations, you have to understand the broader plans of the Comintern for the world revolution, specifically in the 1920s. So obviously the communists first accepted this kind of state ideology that Czechs and Slovaks are one people. But then as the Comintern starts giving more attention to the national question, and this is around 22, 23, this same idea from Russia that the national question can be a catalyst for revolution is then starting to be applied in other contexts. So they say, well, we can't just negate the fact that a lot of Slovaks are feeling different ethnic attachments than the Czechs. We can't, we can't avoid the fact that the Ruthenians or Hungarians or Germans kind of are, that they kind of don't identify with either of those two. And we have to see how to frame these countries' existing demands in a way that is going to further the goals of the communist revolution. And obviously that changes. So, they are more skeptical of Czechoslovak territorial unity in the mid-20s. From 1928 on, it kind of moves even to some relatively open support for secessionism. Obviously, with the Popular Front in 1935, that changes again because you're hoping to preserve the territorial unity of Czechoslovakia before Hitler's advancements. So it very much changes based on the situation. But if we look more broadly, I think one thing that's also important to emphasize, which is not immediately visible from the Czechoslovak case, for instance, is that you also have the Comintern as an agent of nation building. So in the same way that the Soviet Union is maybe creating nations within the USSR, as Terry Martin had described, the Comintern is also creating nations. So don't get into it so much with Ruthenians that it quickly moves to just, Ruthenians are Ukrainians and it should be part of Ukraine. But it is something that, for instance, I'm dealing with in my work, because that's very much what happens in Macedonia. And there's still a lot of controversies about this. Ukrainian nationalists to this day are talking about how Macedonia is a totalitarian creation because the state was created by the communists and a lot of Macedonian nation building was done by the communists. But, you know, obviously that's an ideological story that misses the point. And the very interesting point is that, yes, the Comintern does take part in nation building in Macedonia. And why does it do that? Well, it does that because they think that that's going to further the cause of the communist revolution in the Balkans. And Macedonia is a particularly successful case, for instance, whereas there are other cases where this completely fails. So everybody talks about Macedonia now because of these ongoing controversies within the EU, but there was also talk about a Thracian nation, you know, going back to the ancient times, but there was very serious talk about also self-determination for the Thracians. Obviously, very few people were as receptive to that as they were, for instance, to Macedonia or to the idea of, you know, Ukrainian self-determination within Subcarpathian Ruthenia, but it was also a thing that existed. So I think we can look at the nation building in the international communist movement in the 1920s broadly is as part of three different levels. So one is kind of using this irredentism of the former Russian imperial territories like Subcarpathian Ruthenia or Bessarabia to spread the revolution. Another is a creation of new nations, which is something we don't see in the Czechoslovak case, but we see elsewhere. And I'm sure if we look at, for instance, the colonies of European states, we could see even more. And some of them being successful, like Macedonia. And then the final group, the kind of botched nation building projects that came from the Comintern, they saw, you know, some potential in places like Thrace developing their ethnic identities, but those ultimately failed. I hope that answers your question.
Dobře, moc krát děkuji. Poprosím Molly, jestli by ještě chtěla něco.
Thank you very much. And if Molly would like to add something to this intensive and extensive answer, and you are most welcome.
Czechoslovak case. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Unity Congress brings together not only different nations, but different national communist traditions. And so I would say the two key traditions that were brought together in the KSČ actually had two different approaches to the nationality question. So you had the Czech branch, which was generally Austro-Marxist, and the Austro-Marxist view came from the fact that a nation is determined, right, it's Otto Bauer and Karl Renner's perception of nation, which is a nation is created by language, culture, education, and local administration. It's a perception of nation that was developed by a national minority in a multinational empire, right? So you have the Czech tradition, and then you have the German tradition, which if you look at it actually develops, so this is right, Karl Kreibich and the Liberec German branch. That's actually a much more based on Rosa Luxemburg's tradition, and you read the German newspapers in the early 1920s, and you see them reference, Rosa Luxemburg rather than, Otto Bauer, right? So you sort of have which is the idea that you don't, you sort of ignore the national question. You don't take it into account, and so you actually have the KSČ is a compromise, I would say, in many ways between these two perceptions of the decentralized view of the nation and that had developed in the Czech national tradition and the highly centralized one that had actually developed in the German national tradition from their social democratic movement, which is much more oriented toward the German. And I would say the Comintern sort of compromise is really the compromise between those two traditions, where you actually have a highly centralized system, but within the creation of these nations. And the difference between, and I'll stop with this because I think we've gone on, but the difference between, so Stalin's works on nationality are written as a reaction against Otto Bauer and Karl Renner's, and the difference is essentially the question of whether a nation is linked to territory. And so in the Austro-Marxist tradition, it's not. In the Stalinist-Leninist tradition, it is. And this is a huge argument in 1924 onward, as Stefan has pointed out, not only in the Yugoslav case, but in the Czechoslovak case, because effectively adopting the Soviet model means instigating irredentism. And for a very long time, Šmeral and Krajbich and others do not want to do this. They know how dangerous this is. And Czechoslovakia is particular because it borders, of course, on countries that these national minorities belong to, right? So if you instigate German irredentism, that's gonna, they're gonna want to join Germany. Hungary is the same, Poland is the same, right? Because of the situation, the geographic situation of Czechoslovakia, it was for several years considered dangerous to instigate irredentism movements because they would want to join these neighboring states, and this is talked about at length. So I would say a shift toward a more Soviet nationality policy, linking nationality to territory, is evident from 1924 onward with the Bolshevization Congress, and it's extremely dangerous, I think, in instigating these actively instigating national conflicts. But I'll end there.
Dobře, děkuji, Molly. Bohužel my nemáme už moc času, přetahujeme něco, takže já bych vás teď rád vyzval, jestli někdo z vás...
Thank you, Molly. We are now running out of time, so if any of you have any question to anyone else of our contributors today.
So if you have any questions to your colleagues, so please raise a hand. So there is some limited space for questions. Tak jestli ne, já bych měl jenom možná dva krátké dotazy.
Okay, if there are no questions, that I'd have perhaps two brief questions for Vít Smetana and Marta Edith Holečková. How do you explain the positive impression that Klement Gottwald and other communists made in British diplomats? Were they good actors, or did the doctrine of building national paths of socialism, giving them enough space to be open in front of the diplomats? So that's a question for Vít. And I would like to ask Marta whether the Indonesians and Indonesian students at the University of 17 November met some specific welcome compared to students from other countries. Thank you for your brief answers, because we really don't have much time. I'm not sure I will manage to be concise. But if to answer concisely, then I would say it was both. Of course, they played a nationalist card, and they played it so well that Western diplomats, Steinhardt included, got caught by it. And for sure, that was a major mistake of the American and British diplomacy. They really got the impression that the communism in Czechoslovakia could be a standardized political tool in the international scene, and that the radical approach was receding. So those radicals who were promoting radical attacks, the diplomatic corpses thought, okay, we can push economically, and that would solve the question. In my opinion, what it seemed like at the beginning was that it works. It seemed that it works. Beneš and Masaryk thought that it was indeed happening, that the communist pressure was retreating in 1946. That they could keep on playing this card and just keep going, continue the negotiations, the repaying people whose property was nationalized and so on. But that was a big mistake to believe that. And the communists were very decent with Steinhardt. They were going for those hunting meetings and so on. Kopecký could be very pleasant at these events. And Steinhardt thought, okay, he's not a radical, he's fine. Just another, guy in the party, but it was not the case. Nicholas was more down to earth, but of course the welcoming attitude had its limits, as we know. There were other more important places and countries, and so they focused on bigger threats. And of course, if the country has some binding relationships to certain countries, then they act accordingly. And there was the precedence of the interwar development. We said we can't, the British said we can't get active in places where we can't get our army to. And this is not just my naive Anglophilia, it's based on a comparative analysis of the British policy to Czechoslovakia. Marta, please, just 2 or 3 sentences, because we really have to end. I believe that these groups of Indonesian students didn't stir so many emotions as Arab students or African students. They were considered as very adaptive, very decent, very nice people. But one trait of their behavior that could irritate the Czechoslovaks or the Czechoslovak environment was the local food. Of course, their eating habits were altogether different. And one of my key witnesses said that he would go to eat to restaurants because he couldn't digest the food available in the university canteen. And this is one of the things that were considered as inappropriate behavior, as a bourgeois behavior of the students who were here as part of international aid and shouldn't behave that way because the university canteen is fine enough for Czechoslovak students, etc. After the bloody coup d'etat in 1965, there was a lot of feelings and compassion aimed at these Indonesian students because their destiny was viewed as terrible. So the way the university accepted them was very welcoming, very human in the specific displays of affection. So I am sorry that we ran out of time. Of course, this online version of conference doesn't give us the opportunity to talk directly and so on. And I hope that soon we will be able to meet in person and organize conferences in the classic way, in the way we used to. I would like to thank you all for your interesting contributions. And should you have any more questions, then of course don't hesitate to contact one another, comments, questions, etc. But Unfortunately, we miss the unofficial part of the conference where we can carry on in these discussions, such as at lunch. So I would like to say goodbye to you now, to all of our panelists. And I would just remind you that the magazine Securitas Imperii, published by the Institute for Study of Totalitarian Regimes, prepares an international issue dedicated to the 100th anniversary of founding the KSČ. And you are all welcome to edit your contributions into an article that could be published within this special issue, so you can also get in touch with the people who do this. And thank you again for being part of this conference, and have a good time.